I would like to start my video by speaking about the issues that are happening right now between Palestine and Israel. I do believe that the current violence therein only perpetuates the cycles of death, destruction, and despair and pushes further to the horizon any hopes of coexistence and peace. Fighting must stop immediately. And while we analyze this topic, it's very important to remind the utterly appalling hostilities that have been also described as such by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, while the United Nations Security Council met regarding the matter. The region is at risk. The Secretary General feared the violence could have devastating, far reaching consequences. Indeed, the fighting risks dragging Israelis and Palestinians into a spiral of violence with devastating consequences for both communities and for the entire region, as he described the situation. It has the potential to unleash an uncontainable security and humanitarian crisis and to further foster the extremism, not only in the situation of Palestine and Israel, but in the region as a whole, potentially creating a new locus of dangerous instability. The United Nations chief stressed that the only way forward is to return to negotiations towards a two-state solution, but the fighting is making this goal even more challenging. Very important to reiterate here the United Nations commitment to working with the Israeli and Palestinians and with the international and regional partners to realize a lasting stability in the region. This senseless cycle of bloodshed and destruction must stop immediately. On another hand, when we speak about the three Ds that characterize this situation right now, unfortunately, death, displacement, and destruction, Tor Wennesland, the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East process, outlined the human cost of the deadly escalation between the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. Preliminary figures show some 181 Palestinians and 9 Israelis have been killed, while health authorities in Gaza report 1,200 people have been injured. The United Nations envoy added that the humanitarian and security situation in the densely packed Gaza Strip grows increasingly dire by the day, and the embattled health system is already overwhelmed by chronic shortages of medicine and equipment and now the COVID 19 pandemic consequences. Additionally, over 34,000 people have been displaced and more than 40 schools operated by UN agency UNRWA are now serving as shelters. As a result of the military operation, 7 factories, 40 schools, and at least 4 hospitals sustained complete or partial damage. At least 18 buildings, including 4 high rise towers, have been destroyed and over 350 buildings damaged, according to the IDF. These buildings contained Hamas military installations. So this is very important to remind Israelis and Palestinians have a legitimate right to safety and security. The violence that is witnessed right now is unacceptable and unjustifiable. After that, I want to get back here to speak on about another important briefing related to the situation of Libya, a statement of the International Criminal Court prosecutor to the United Nations Security Council pursuant to United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970 of 2011. First, I want to commend the endeavors that were made by the Kingdom of Morocco in order to work between both parties in the Libyan conflict. Let's always remind, as I have said before, that the big issue here was the fact that both parties never helped the peace enforcement process by non respecting their own commitments, neither the United Nations security resolutions that are related to this matter. So it's true that on October 23rd, 2020, we witnessed the signing of a historical ceasefire agreement by Libyan parties in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations. and that the fact that there is a recent inauguration of a new interim government of national unity is another commendable milestone for this context of action. But lasting peace and stability remain crucial pillars of development and protections in Libya. Much hope rests on the government of national unity to work in an efficient and inclusive manner to address the violence and political turmoil that has engulfed the country and to secure peace and stability in Libya. There can be no lasting peace without accountability and justice in this regard. So, very important here to get back to the reporting of the International Criminal Court regarding the issues that are related to criminal investigations department, the work with the Ministry of Defense and several forensic agencies regarding the status of national investigations in terms of complementarity and cooperation as well. The team of the ICC met survivors and the family members of the young men who were injured or killed during the airstrike on the Hadba Military College in Tripoli on January the 4th, 2020, as well as with displaced persons from Benghazi and numerous victims of the crimes committed in Tarhuna. So another effort is related to the fact that the United Nations support mission in Libya, the UNSMIL, must keep forward and continue cooperative relationship to work with the International Criminal Court in order to ensure effective justice throughout joint efforts and good cooperation with the national authorities and as well with key partners of the UNSMIL. Very important to collect in this context of action credible information and evidence on serious crimes allegedly committed in official and unofficial detention facilities in Libya, in particular related to the Mitiga prison controlled by the Special Deterrence Force and the Gernada and Al Kuwaifiya detention facilities controlled by the militia known as the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, previously called the Libyan National Army or LNA, and its associated forces. These crimes, which include large-scale torture, sexual violence, inhuman treatment, and arbitrary detention, have been reported for years, but regrettably to date, the perpetrators have not been held accountable. For the credible report detailed the summary conviction and sentencing of civilians to long prison sentences, including handling of death penalty by military courts in eastern Libya following secret trials devoid of fair trial guarantees. So the ICC received documents accordingly and other materials supporting these reports. The scale of those alleged crimes in large, the UNSMIL reports that more than 8,850 individuals are arbitrarily detained at 28 official prisons in Libya in judicial police custody with an estimated 60 to 70% pre-trial detention. An additional 10,000 individuals are detained in other detention facilities run by militia and armed groups, including about 480 women and 63 juveniles and children. It's very mandatory to urge all parties to the conflict in Libya to immediately put an end to the use of detention facilities to mistreat and commit these crimes against civilians and persons hors de combat. International law and the Rome Statute prohibit the use of detention facilities in this manner. And very important as well to reiterate on another hand the critical importance for international observers and investigators to be given full access to all detention facilities in Libya and to receive full cooperation in this regard. The government of national unity must take urgent steps to put an end to the crimes committed in detention centers and to fully investigate allegations of arbitrary detention, torture, confiscation of property, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, including in prisons and detention facilities. The International Criminal Court has been following the targeting of civilians who dare to voice opposition to the actions of militias in the east and west of Libya, the violent silencing of public critics as a method to terrorize the civilian population reached another low point with the despicable murder of lawyers such as Mrs. Hanan al-Barasi in Benghazi in November of last year. The International Criminal Court condemns as well these crimes in the strongest possible terms and calls upon the civil and military authorities in Libya to duly investigate and prosecute the persons responsible for these crimes. The office reiterates its call to the Libyan authorities to fully investigate the disappearance of Mrs. Siham Sergawa, an elected member of the House of the Representatives, who has been missing since her abduction in Benghazi on July 17, 2019. Moreover, the ICC has received concerning information regarding the activities of mercenaries and foreign fighters in Libya. This information is consistent with the findings of the UNSMIL panel of experts reports. The office of the ICC fully supports the call of this armed group and individuals to leave Libya without delay, and emphasizing on crimes committed by mercenaries and foreign fighters on Libyan territories that might fall under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, no matter the nationality of the persons involved. Encouraging the Council and all the member states of the United Nations to once again convey a clear and firm message to leaders and commanders, be they military or civilian, and all parties and armed groups involved in Libya and the conflict in Libya, that the rules of international humanitarian law must be respected and that those who defy such rules will be held individually responsible. The ongoing victimization of migrants in Libya, the office has concretely enhanced in this matter cooperation, coordination, and exchange of information and expertise with national authorities of Europol, in example, under the office strategic goal 6 in order to advance our respective work in terms of counterterrorism and in terms of investigations. Very important to call partners to intensify efforts in the matter with the aim of strengthening collective efforts in addressing impunity for serious crimes against migrants in Libya. Many recent reports about another shipwreck in the last week of April 2021, leading to the death of over 100 migrants, as well as reports about the ongoing abuse and exploitation of migrants, and underline the urgent need for national authorities to partner and work with agencies to intensify their efforts to prevent further tragedies and crimes. So very important to focus on justice for victims and affected communities in Libya that cannot be effectively achieved without the collective efforts towards the timely arrest and surrender of those that are basically having warrants of arrest and that have been issued by the International Criminal Court. There has been no tangible progress in securing the execution of any of these warrants, and this is an obligation that falls mainly on states. Over the years, we have witnessed individuals that have been trying to work under the auspice of the United Nations Security Council regarding this matter, and wanting to get back here to the individuals against whom warrants of arrest have been issued that remain specifically at large. And one of these individuals was Mr. Mahmoud Mustafa Busaif al-Warfali, who, as a commander of the Al-Saiqa Brigade, was alleged to have executed 43 civilians as specified in 2 arrest warrants. Credible reports indicate that he was killed in Benghazi on the 24th of March earlier this year. In addition, Mr. Al-Tuhami Muhammad Khalid, allegedly responsible for the perpetration of serious crimes, including torture, has also reportedly died in Cairo, in Egypt. Regrets are there for victims and families of the crimes allegedly committed by Mr. Al Wafarli and Mr. Al Tuhami that have been denied justice and closure through the court sphere and independent and impartial judicial proceedings. The unwillingness of those in power in eastern Libya to transfer Mr. Wafarli to the court or to genuinely investigate and prosecute him has contributed to a climate of impunity. The same lack of cooperation is evident with regard to the surrender of Mr. Al Tuhami by the Egyptian authorities. While the deaths of these suspects, if confirmed, will not stop the ongoing investigations in the situation in Libya, they constitute a tragic example of suspected perpetrators escaping accountability for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. The International Criminal Court, in cooperation with the United Nations Security Council, equally notes the decrease in the number of reported crimes under the court's jurisdiction since the ceasefire and the inauguration of the new government. It is nevertheless a matter of concern that many serious crimes, in particular those targeting civilians, have gone unpunished. In particular, when we speak about relations of the ICC with Europol in matters of mutual interest that have been enhanced, fruitful engagement with the panel of experts on Libya as well as the independent fact-finding mission on Libya have also greatly facilitated sharing of knowledge and expertise. So it's very important to focus and continue to deliver the mandate independently and impartially in Libya from the angle of the International Criminal Court in order to facilitate the work of the United Nations Security Council in this matter. The third thing I want to invoke here, the topic will be related right now to the situation in Sudan and also standing with the international conference to support the Sudanese transition that was being hosted by France at the United Nations. And it's very important to get back here to speak about the issues of delivering sustainable peace enforcement and development for all the diverse society of Sudan, commending the government of Sudan for undertaking difficult economic reforms, and these mark major milestones on the country's path to resilience and progress. The Sudanese people have indeed suffered too long. Very important to commend the government for its peacemaking efforts with the signatories and non-signatories of the Juba Peace Agreement and its determination to establish the rule of law, broaden the civic peace, and ensure inclusivity for all the citizens. The conference was part of an ongoing effort to bring Sudan back into the international community. Generous donors' support is, of course, instrumental for Sudan to achieve debt relief under the highly indebted Poor Country Initiative. So those countries which have assisted Sudan in clearing its arrears with the international financial institutions are working for continued supports to Sudan partners that is right now critical. If financial assistance and investments are not forthcoming, the continued dire economic situation could severely affect Sudan's transition with negative consequences for peace enforcement and stability in the country and the region and beyond as well. Very important to demonstrate the international will in this context of action to help the country turn the page on this economic crisis. Sudan needs investment and a sustained commitment to rebuild, including from the private sector. It has regained eligibility for funding from the international financial institution, which provides an important foundation for Sudan's economic revival. Sudan is undergoing historical, political, and economic transformation, and that's the bottom line. It's very important to focus here on the economic development of the country through regional development, not only a focus on the Khartoum Durman metropolitan area as well as Wad Madani, but all the regions of the country. Now I want to speak about the core topic that I wanted to elaborate during this video. It will be related to a very critical one. Following with the series of the enduring nuclear threats, I will speak now about rethinking the military industrial complex, how the Western states' legal foundation work in this context of action. I would like to start by invoking something very interesting. What if the object of analysis is irrational in this context? What if events are being willed by no single causative historical logic, the increasingly aggressive military posture of world imperialism, etc.? A logic which then may be analyzed in terms of origins, intentions, or goals, contradictions, or conjunctures, but are simply the products of messy inertia. This inertia may have drifted down to us as a collocation of fragmented forces, political and military formations, ideological imperatives, weapon technologies. An example. This is a context of analyzing the extremism on the last stage of civilization context. Activists long have used the term military industrial complex for purposes both analytical and polemical. The concept was brought to prominence at the height of the Cold War by one of the preeminent architects of the immense constellations of institutions it describes, the US General and President Dwight D. Eisenhower. But like those institutions, the concept of the military industrial complex has drifted down to us as much by inertia as by volition, a tool picked up when convenient but seldom sharpened, modified, retooled. In the post Cold War period, peace and disarmament advocates have sought to build broader coalitions by stressing the diversion of resources from human needs to military spending and by highlighting the ability of military industrial complex organizations to deploy their economic power in order to sustain spending on armaments and a militarized foreign policy. This effort had little success. We are now in a time clearly distinguishable from the immediate post Cold War period, one characterized by the relative decline of US power, the rise of resurgence of its nuclear armed adversaries, and the climate of intense international economical and geopolitical competition in a fragile, crisis ridden global economy. If the concept of the military industrial complex is to be useful, it must be rethought in this moment. This would be a major undertaking requiring the work of many. I can basically elaborate this issue of the US military industrial complex that has been portrayed as diverging resources from human needs, shaping the path of technology and economic development in ways that make it less democratic and less ecologically sustainable and increase the risk of war. Like I said, I'm speaking here about topics by using the hashtag skip the narrative. The ability of military industrial complex institutions to do all this has been attributed to their economic power and its deployment in a money driven political system, although some critics highlight their ideological influences as well. The national laboratories, arms contractors, and universities that constitute the civilian side of the complex long have been seen as occupying the commanding heights of the economy, conducting cutting edge research, skimming off the best resources, and spinning off products that sparked waves of civilian technology development, from passenger aircraft to semiconductors to the internet. The US military industrial complex is seen as primarily tool for risky long-term technology investment planning and also macroeconomic management in a country whose political classes seldom acknowledge the need for any such public functions. The all of the above, but different degrees at times, have created a massive armed bureaucracies, military industries, and supporting intellectual apparatus we refer to as the military industrial complex that have been with us for three quarters of a century, spanning the rise of the US military power to its apex and the beginnings of its decline. Its birth preceded and helped to engender and sustain Cold War, but it survived both the Cold War end and a period quite brief in retrospect of ideological disarray in a post-Cold War era, now definitively in the past. The era of the military industrial complex also has encompassed the rise of the US economy to its greatest heights in technology, leadership, manufacturing capacity, and the dominance of international markets. And its decline as well, now more pronounced than the waning of the United States military preeminence. The role of the military industrial complex in this context of action basically could not have remained the same through all this. While the long term of the role of the military industrial complex in shaping the economy is important, the most urgent task of this moment is, once again, as it was during the Cold War, reducing the near term risk of war among nuclear armed great powers. So the question we must ask is whether invoking the military industrial complex and focusing on profit driven interest and direct money driven political influences should continue to be so strongly emphasized in organizing for peace enforcement, or whether doing so ignores other important aspects of this moment. So, the important clever topic to deliberate while we're going further in this context of action is periodicizing the military industrial complex. We must consider that the military industrial complex has developed through at least four distinct phases. The first was that constructed by the society-wide efforts of World War II. This military-industrial complex centered on assembly line mass production, employing tens of millions to produce hundreds of thousands of airplanes, vehicles, and watercraft to support millions of soldiers. It also initiated the age of massive institutionalized government-funded research and development, of which the atomic bomb project was only the leading example. After a post-war lull, the Cold War military-industrial complex continued to mass-produce weapon systems to serve military forces with millions under arms, while at the same time conducting a nuclear arm race served and driven by a complex of government, corporate, and university research efforts. US political leaders used military spending as a tool of post-war economic management and initiated an immense infrastructure projects like the interstate highway system in the name of national defense. This was Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. It reached peak levels of activity and spending during the Korean and Vietnamese wars, when the United States was both conducting large-scale land wars and continuing to develop and expand a massive nuclear arsenal. The second phase came after the brief post-Vietnam period of détente between the United States and the USSR. The US ramped up arms research and production again at the beginning of the 1980s, developing new generations of nuclear weapons and delivery systems and pursuing a variety of technologies for ballistic missiles defense. The Soviet Union responded in kind to the extent that it was capable. During this period, the vast network of weapons laboratories and factories, already entrenched for decades, seemed to drive the arms race in a way not too reducible to the financial interests of the arms makers, the ideologies of the competing superpowers, or the long-term thrust of the United States expansion as the world's dominant economic power. Edward Thompson wrote, as the decade began. Viewed in this way, the USA and the USSR do not military industrial complexes, they are such complex. The leading sector, weapon systems and their supports, does not occupy a vast societal space, and official secrecy encourages low visibility, but it stamps its priorities on the society as a whole. It also inflects the direction of growth. Despite the immense momentum of the Cold War arms race and the apparent dominance by the military-industrial complex of the commanding heights of the economy, military spending as a percentage of gross domestic product already was on the downslope, with the highest level of spending in the 1980s never matching the 1950s and 1960s peaks. This decline stemmed from a variety of factors, including economic growth that diminished their relative share of military expenditures. Other significant developments during this period included the substitution of significantly smaller numbers of more complex, capable ships, aircrafts, and military vehicles, and smaller uniformed forces for the mass armies and mass produced machines of World War II through Vietnam. This period also saw a notable consolidation of the armaments industry into smaller numbers of larger, more diversified firms. The collapse of the Soviet Union and its alliance system deprived the immense, permanently mobilized military apparatus of its main raison d'etre. The end of the Cold War brought a decade of military budgets below Cold War levels, even in absolute terms. Further diminishing the military industrial complex economic share, this period was characterized by further consolidation of the arms industry, now dominated by a small number of very large firms, ideologically disarrayed. This constituted a distinct third phase of the military industrial complex, lasting until September 11, 2001 attacks, which triggered the resurgence of spending for conventional armaments and expanded forces to fight a shifting array of wars, of occupation, and counterinsurgency on a global scale. It could be argued that the post 9/11 fourth iteration of the military industrial complex has two subphases, or perhaps that we are moving into a new and distinct fifth phase. During the early 2000s, the US military has focused on the classic problems of managing a far-flung empire, how to prevail against a greater number of less organized adversaries in many locales by employing advantages in mobility, communication, surveillance, and firepower at a cost politically acceptable at the national level. I remember, of course, the hectic time the United States had back then during the George W. Bush administration. When I left from Casablanca to New York, my dad looked at me and basically he was telling me through his eye contact, the American people have a hectic time right now, Youssef, and I do not doubt on your skills. I do not doubt on the greatness of the United States. I just fear, my son, that you cannot make it in how the system runs over there. And in addition, there was all this hectic pressure that was at the desk of President George W. Bush during that time, which has just made the thing for my situation just a challenge to make it here. My dad came to visit me here, and he came to see me in McAllen, Texas, where I used to be living, and he also did the transfer of the plane in the George Bush airports in Houston while coming from New York to McAllen. I remember that. So the second topic in this matter is rethinking the military-industrial complex by focusing on the return of great power tensions and strategic arm racing. However, it does not mean the re-emergence of a US military-industrial complex much resembles of any of its past version. Too much has changed in the armed forces and armaments deployed by the most powerful states. Even more has changed perhaps in the structure of the global economy and the role related to economic power of the United States. All of this affects the capacity of the US to sustain its military dominance, but it also may affect the relative power of the military-industrial complex in the US economy and polity, and the ability of the United States elites to use the military-industrial complex effectively as a tool for technology development and economic management. These changes are of such magnitude and complexity that they can only be sketched here. From the 1970s onward, military spending as a percentage of gross domestic product has trended steadily downward, reaching a low of about 3% in the late 1990s. The military budget increased drastically in the 2000s for the reason that I have mentioned earlier, doubling as a percentage of the GDP during the post 9/11 war on terror military buildup and the invasions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, but still never matching peak Cold War shares of the US economy. Reduction of the military budget during the 1990s were accompanied by an acceleration of consideration in the arms industry and also by several rounds of closures of US domestic military bases. Both reduced the pervasive geographic and economic presence of the military and the arms industry. The professionalization of the armed forces and changes in military technology resulted in smaller forces equipped with smaller numbers of more capable, complex, and expensive weapon systems. Due to long-term developments stretching back to the latter phases of the Cold War, the budget increases during the 2000s did not bring an expansion in the domestic footprint from the military industrial complex. It did, however, spawn a new array of foreign bases, large and small, to fight the decades long small wars and convert counterinsurgency campaigns of the war on terror. The declining military industrial complex share of the economy may also mean it will have less impact as a leading sector in technology development and as a tool of management of the economy as a whole. The Defense Department's role in scientific research and in technology research and development has declined significantly since the Cold War. Research and technology development benefits from proximity with manufacturing facilities in related industries. Offshoring the US manufacturing has reduced the opportunities for such synergies. In addition, offshoring manufacturing means that innovations flowing from military related to research and development are less likely to create domestic manufacturing jobs. Attempts to use military spending as means for macroeconomic management and particularly to create jobs throughout the economy seem likely to be less successful than in the past. In an increasingly polarized global and domestic economy, older, smaller industrial centers and rural hinterlands have been largely left behind. More components of inexpensive high-tech weapon systems are likely to be purchased from enterprises clustered in the metropolitan areas where the newer technology industries have developed areas already well integrated into an increasingly insular top tier of global trade and investment. New areas of military spending, such as private contracting in intelligence and information technologies, also are likely to be concentrated in successfully globalized cities. It seems unlikely that military spending in the old industrial heartlands will diffuse far beyond immediate locales of military bases and industries with plants and supply chains long established in particular regions. And while the more diversified and globalized metropolitan areas may be the recipients of a significant amount of military spending, it continues a smaller slice of their economies. There are some counter trends. The general decline of US manufacturing may mean that military related industries will continue to play an outsized role in that sector. It also is important to note that foreign military sales always have played a key role in the US armaments industry. Foreign sales typically are more profitable than domestic military contracting and also somewhat counter-cyclical, helping to keep production lines open and companies profitable when US military acquisitions dip. The expansion of quasi-military homeland security functions ranging from pervasive surveillance to the militarization of state and local police both provide additional outlets for military-grade technologies and integrates internal security more closely with the military. It seems unlikely, however, that these latter developments are primarily driven by the potential or market power for the military-industrial complex. Rather, they likely are a consequence of elite demands for more state repression capacity in a society characterized by growing polarization of wealth, top-down attacks on an already threadbare welfare state, and a political system dominated by big money. They are also counter-trend shaped by the interplay of distinctive political geography of the United States, of its changing economic landscape, In rural areas and older secondary industrial zones, military bases and arms factories may be among the few enterprises that provide hope for economic growth and for stable, decent paying jobs that are not easily offshored. The rounds of base closures in the 1990s and early 2000s further concentrated the United States' active military bases in the Southeast. The structure of the US Congress and the Electoral College gives disproportionate weight to states with low population, and years of Republican domination of state politics have allowed them to craft safe districts where they are strong, which includes many encompassing military bases and armed facilities. But we have different predicaments depending on the Clinton era, depending on the Bush era, depending on the Trump era, in example. All of this likely gives the military, the industrial complex, additional weight in the political process, mitigating the decline of its purely economic significance. And it also contributes to the polarization and deadlock of United States politics and provides a staunch long-term base for those who would appeal to nationalism and militarism. Um, the most important thing also that we have to mention here is the power of the US military industrial complex appearing undiminished in several matters when we speak about the context of the defense secretary, the national security advisors, the White House chief of staff position most commonly agreed to the work of military officers and civilians. Appointing executives from weapon contractors to key posts in the defense departments, including the top executives from, in example, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and Textron, is an important matter. In this thing that has been done during the Trump era in terms of governance, that's true. So I would like to deliberate furthermore this topic by speaking about the task before us and go into the fact that if we are to form effective strategies to prevent wars and to move towards a more peaceful, enforcing environment, fair and ecologically sustainable global society, we must do more than merely describe the power of the military industrial complex. We must try to understand its role in this particular moment, its weakness and irrationalities, as well as its economic and political strength. We also must consider whether the military industrial complex as a defining future of this moment, as many thought to be during the Cold War, whether other drivers of war have much or more weights. Nowadays, as has been the case since the end of the Cold War, the military industrial complex appears in US political discourse most often as guns versus butter, between quotes. It's an argument. Peace and disarmament groups hoping to build larger coalitions try to connect to environmental and social justice movements by comparing military expenditures to social spending. We must consider the possibility, however, that organizations looking for ways to increase public spending for the environment and human needs might see other, less challenging opportunities to redirect sources. Restructuring the healthcare system so that it has its share of the GDP is close to that of other wealthy countries. For example, could free up close to $1 trillion annually, equals the more expensive estimates of total military spending. A very modest financial transaction, sufficiently mainstream to have been included in a Congressional Budget Office list of revenue options, would raise more than $70 billion per year, far more than the estimated annual cost of maintaining and modernizing the US nuclear arsenals as of today. The constellations of organizations that benefit from maintaining the status quo in these areas of government's policy do not doubt and would resist, but environmental and social justice campaigners appear to feel that taking them on is more feasible than confronting the military establishment and the national security states. Nowadays, the current federal administration should follow to work on environmental and social justice issues, believing that addressing it will relatively narrow the use and the issue of the military spending as likely to alienate supporters, weakening rather than strengthening their coalitions. The reason for this is that the United States, after three quarters of a century of permanent mobilization for war, has fallen into the grips of full blown militarism. As Alfred Wagner framed in his classical history of the phenomenon militarism, covers every system of thinking and valuing and every complex of feeling which rank military institutions and ways above the ways of civilian life, carrying military mentality and modes of acting and decisions into the civilian sphere. Polling data consistently shows that Americans have more trust and confidence in the military than any other public or private institution. But one does not need to turn to polling data to see that is so. Quasi religious worship of all things military is omnipresent in American society, from overflight of military aircraft at premier supporting events to pervasive advertising tropes to the ritual celebration of the troops by politicians of all stripes and the playing of the military card to trump all arguments in context of ranging from the federal budget to racial injustice. If we want to move the United States towards a more peaceful path, we need to find ways to directly address this deeply entrenched militarism, which is the domestic ideological face both of the military industrial complex and of a hegemonic foreign policy long underwritten by military force. We also need to make honest economic arguments. We cannot, for example, suggest to people clinging by military industrial complex in their enterprises and jobs in regions otherwise abandoned by the top tier organization of private capital and the state that a better future for them requires anything less than a profound transformation of the economy as a whole. The problem is not that we must choose between guns and butter. The money spent on armaments pale in comparison to the quantities accumulated by the top tier of wealthy organizations across the rest of a relatively lightly regulated economy with a weak welfare state. The choice we face is between the path we are on and the society that is fair, humane, and sustainable. The root of the connections between a movement for peace and against militarism and other movements is not that so much spent on the military but an economy whose animated principle is endless competition for wealth among immense authoritarian organization is inimical to democracy, justice, and the ecological requisites of human survival. That's where I started my whole concept that was called Sustainability for Progress, while I was in the meantime focusing professionally on fostering and counter-terrorism. The risk of war among great powers in a nuclear armed world poses an existential threat to humanity. We must find a way to talk about these fundamental realities in a way that works in this moment, in this place. The current time around, the task of holding off catastrophe may be more difficult. The impetus provided by residual power of the military industrial complex, augmented by increased military spending, is only one vector pushing towards war. There are reasons to believe that other factors play a stronger, more immediate role. Competition for resources and markets is reminiscent of early 20th century struggles among great powers, another moment when a long run of industrial expansion, accumulation, and concentration of wealth and globalization of trade and investment reached its limits. The opening of the old communist bloc countries as a frontier, offering new markets and cheap skilled labor, was a factor keeping great power conflicts in abeyance in the immediate post-Cold War period. So too was the relative weakness of the ruling strata in Russia and China amidst the ideological and economic disruption that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. But today, ruling elites in both countries are seeking to exert a greater degree of control over both their own economies and their near abroad. The contradictory dynamics underlying the current state of the United States military industrial complex reflect a deeper mismatch between the power of a still dominant United States military and the US economy in relative decline. It is this more fundamental disjuncture that seems likely to impel dangerous behavior by the ruling economic and political classes in the United States. Rulers who believe their country has reached its apex and is declining relative, so its principal adversaries may be tempted to push their waning military advantage to the utmost, risking wars if not starting them intentionally. So the acuteness of danger is open to debate. Both Russia and China face daunting obstacles in their own development paths, including unprecedented problems posed by global resource limits and ecological decline. This may mean that military and political leadership in the United States will see the challenges they pose as less pressing, containable with relatively cautious policies, but it also raises the risk of a fatal coalition, particularly in the event of another global economic downturn, as unfortunately we're seeing right now with the global pandemic, that may tempt all their leadership to deploy nationalist and military strategies that once again displace blame outward, justify repression, and place masses of discontented young people under military discipline. The work of understanding today's military industrial complex is also just beginning and must be undertaken with an eye to informing the strategies we need. Much is different from the Cold War moment, but certain grim similarities remain. We must recognize that preventing catastrophic war once again must be our main priority. Not one more nickel needs to be spent on bases, forces, or modernized nuclear weapons to put in place the mechanism for our collective annihilation. It is already there. So, I would like to go further to speak about other contexts of action in future videos related to this very, very important topic of the enduring nuclear threat. To conclude my video, I would like just to speak a little bit about my passion for movies. Of course, there is nobody that will tell you that has no passion for sports or movies. I spoke about sport before. I'm a human being. I'm gonna speak about my passion. For example, today about mobsters movies. Let's say I will give you a list of the best mobsters movies I like, the mobster related topic. So among my favorite movies figures of course the Godfather trilogy, Once Upon a Time in America, Scarface, Carlito's Way, A Bronx Tale, Goodfellas, The Untouchable, Casino, Heat, Donnie Brasco, Ronin. That's a movie that has been made in France, the French mafia movie of the list, starring Robert De Niro and Jean Reno. The Score, Gangs of New York, The Departed, Rider's Kill, The Irishman, Lord of War, Wonderland, and more or less Copland as well. Of course, I would add two movies. Maybe they are not in the genres of mobsters. They are mostly gonna be called as comedy, but I would consider still these two movies in the list of mobster movies. Analyze this and analyze that with Robert De Niro, Billy Crystal, and Charles Palminteri in the first part. Why? Because when I see all these speeches of Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci in Casino, in example, or in The Irishman, there is some funny parts of them, but the movie still stays realistic upon events that happened in real life. But analyze this and analyze right is really the pinnacle of the comedy in the mobster's world, and that's a very important thing to underline. I like also, but it's another genre in the crimes movies, the series of movies of So as well, and looking forward whenever I have time to see in the movie Spiral, which is the next episode of the series. But to get back to the mobster related movie critics, I wanna hear make some few critics regarding the movie The Irishman, regarding some parts that maybe could have caused disambiguation and confusion. So my questions could be probably to the director Martin Scorsese regarding the use of the World Trade Center in a scene here. We have the murder of Joe Gallo on April the 7th, 1972. And maybe it's me who's wrong. I was not in New York City back then. I was not even born. But the World Trade Center looks fully built. Before the scene showing Frank Sheeran and John Francis going to execute that murder. I know the two skyscrapers were almost ready and operational before the official ribbon cutting ceremony on April the 4th, 1973. But we see them here in a glimpse in the movie, fully operational, before what's gonna happen to Joe Gallo on a year before their ribbon cutting ceremony, which means on April the 7th, 1972. So I just wonder if that was just a mistake or the buildings were already there in full shape at the time. The other thing that could be also related to this event is the use of the comments of Don Rickles that was basically making fun about Joe Gallo while being on the Copacabana nightclub. Correct me if I'm wrong, by trying to speak as Marlon Brando's voice as Vito Corleone in The Godfather. I would think that is realistic because maybe he would have seen the movie that has been released in March 1972 before the events that I have mentioned earlier. One more thing I want to add, maybe this is not relevant to the movie, but some events that were related to the not relevant to the Sheeran Hoffa relationship, because even if we speak about the Sheeran Hoffa relationship, the Joe Gallo situation was not technically related to that. It was more of a Sheeran Bofalino relationship in this matter. But something that is important, maybe that could have been added into the movie, was the issue regarding Sam Giancana, who was the boss of the Chicago outfit mafia back then, and his murder on June 19th, 1975, at his home in Chicago, while he was under subpoena in regards of a plot to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. The beef was quashed, as we say in this matter. Frank Sheeran died on December the 14th, 2003. The same day, the United States forces captured Iraqi's leader Saddam Hussein. Among the other thing I want to add here is the fact that, getting back to conclude about the COVID-19 and its variants, compared by many to Lucifer and his lieutenant, the seven princes of hell, God Almighty. The most optimistic scenario speaks about the end of this by the end of the business year 2022-2023. When I speak about that business year, it starts from September to August, and reimagining a potential post-COVID world, a fully post-COVID world, starting with the business year 2023-2024. That's not me speaking. The only thing that is coming from me in this sentence is related to the period of a business year ongoing from September to August. You have to consider the ifs and maybes in this predicament, and also take in consideration the fact that you have to have a spiral towards a continuous hectic monitoring that could lead to better forecasts and hopefully better results.